4 days ago, CNN reported that U.S. crude oil inventories unexpectedly plunged by 6.2 million barrels in a single week. Stockpiles of gasoline fell sharply. Stockpiles of diesel fell sharply. And an energy analyst named Hussein told CNN that the excess supply buffers that have supported the market only have a few months left before they break. JP Morgan is now warning that global oil inventories are reaching what they call the minimum operational level. And a physical barrel of diesel traded for $200 in Singapore and $286 per barrel in Sri Lanka. Not crude oil. Refined diesel. The stuff that moves every truck, every tractor, every train, every ambulance, and every piece of food from farm to grocery shelf in America. $200 a barrel in Asia. And in California right now, today, not in some worst-case projection, regular unleaded gasoline is $5.85 per gallon. Diesel in California is $7.49. And Fortune magazine reported 2 weeks ago that fuel shortages from the Iran war have spread to Europe and are now spreading to California and the broader West Coast, and that the earliest new pipeline infrastructure could arrive to help is 2029, 3 years from now. 3 years. And summer driving season starts in 6 weeks. 150 million Americans are about to get in their cars for Memorial Day weekend, for July 4th road trips, for summer vacations, for the daily commute in the hottest months when air conditioning pushes electricity demand to its annual peak and refineries are already running at maximum capacity. And the gasoline inventory that is supposed to carry America through that demand surge is being drawn down at a rate that multiple Wall Street banks, the EIA, and the International Energy Agency have all described as unsustainable. Hundreds of gas stations in Australia have already reported fuel shortfalls. European airlines have started canceling flights because of jet fuel shortages. Pakistan has told its citizens to watch sports from home to save fuel. Shell's CEO warned that Europe could face fuel shortages by April, and more than 3 dozen oil and gas traders, executives, brokers, shippers, and advisors told Bloomberg that the world still has not grasped the severity of the situation. This summer, gas could run out. Not in the developing world. In America. And that is not a headline I wrote for clicks. That is the logical conclusion of the data published in the last 72 hours by CNN, Bloomberg, JP Morgan, the EIA, the IEA, Fortune magazine, and more than 3 dozen oil industry professionals who told Bloomberg on the record that the world still has not grasped the severity of the situation. Bloomberg's investigation, published March 30th, reported that prices for refined fuels like diesel and jet fuel have rocketed in recent weeks, at times topping $200 per barrel, and that fuel crunches hitting Asia will soon start spreading west. Europe is likely to face surging prices and is at risk of diesel shortages within weeks. And U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts are starting to consider the prospect that oil prices might surge to an unprecedented $200 per barrel. Not analysts on fringe channels, U.S. consulate government officials considering $200 oil, and the EIA, in their own April 2026 short-term energy outlook, revised their assumptions to acknowledge that they had previously assumed a 1-month disruption. It has now been over 2 months. Their initial projection that the well-supplied market would keep oil prices from exceeding $100 per barrel on a monthly average has already been exceeded. Global inventories have drawn down sharply, shut-in production volumes have increased, and their revised forecast now projects disruptions continuing through late 2026. Late 2026. That takes you through the entire summer, the entire fall, and into the winter heating season. This is not a short-term disruption. This is a structural energy crisis that the forecasting agencies themselves are now admitting they underestimated. Inventories are draining at a rate not seen since economists started measuring, and nobody can refill them fast enough. Oil prices have surged 80% since the Iran war began on February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil and a significant portion of global liquefied natural gas normally transits every single day, has been effectively closed for over 2 months. The IEA called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And the reason gasoline has not yet reached $6 or $7 nationally, the reason you have not yet seen gas lines in most of America, is inventories. Crude oil that was already produced, already transported, already sitting in storage tanks across the country and around the world has been acting as a shock absorber. America was well supplied at the onset of the conflict, but that supply is being consumed and not replaced. CNN reported the 6.2 million barrel weekly decline in U.S. crude inventories. The EIA's April 2026 short-term energy outlook confirmed that global oil inventories have drawn down sharply and that shut-in production volumes have increased, raising their oil price forecast for the coming months. And Economics Help, citing J.P. Morgan analysis, warned that inventories are reaching the minimum operational level, and that as inventories and oil at sea run out, the actual shortage could double from 4 million barrels per day to up to 8 million barrels per day. 8 million barrels per day of shortage in a global market that consumes approximately 100 million barrels per day is an 8% supply deficit. That is not a minor disruption. That is the kind of deficit that, if sustained for weeks, produces physical shortages at the retail level. Gas stations that cannot get delivery, truck stops that ration diesel, airlines that cancel routes, and the EIA's own forecast acknowledges this trajectory. They project that disruptions will continue through late 2026, putting upward pressure on oil prices. Their forecast for retail gasoline prices peaks at a monthly average close to $4.30 per gallon in April. But that forecast was published before CNN's report on the 6.2 million barrel inventory plunge, before JP Morgan's minimum operational level warning, before the Islamabad talks failed, before Trump declared the naval blockade, and before the strait closure entered its third month with no resolution in sight. The $4.30 average is already stale. The EIA's diesel forecast is even more alarming. They project diesel prices peaking above $5.80 per gallon nationally in April. California is already at $7.49, and diesel is not a consumer luxury. Diesel is the circulatory system of the American economy. When diesel becomes scarce or unaffordable, everything downstream from it becomes scarce or unaffordable. Food, medicine, building materials, Amazon packages, water treatment chemicals, hospital supplies, all of it moves on diesel. California is already in crisis, and it is a preview of what happens when refineries close and pipelines do not exist. Fortune's investigation into the West Coast fuel situation documented a structural vulnerability that most Americans outside California have never considered. California, the fourth largest economy in the world, essentially operates as an island sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean on one side and mountainous terrain on the other. That makes it extremely difficult and expensive to build oil and fuel pipelines into the state. A tougher regulatory environment and heightened fuel standards have also made the state's refineries less economical over the years. And the Valero refinery in Benicia, California, one of the state's major refining facilities, closed in April 2026. It is gone. The capacity it provided is gone, and there is nothing replacing it. Phillips 66 and Kinder Morgan plan to build the Western Gateway pipeline system from Texas to Phoenix and Southern California. Pipeline developers, ONEOK and HF Sinclair, are both weighing competing projects. But the Western Gateway is not slated for completion until 2029, which means California has at least 3 years of structural vulnerability during which a prolonged supply disruption, which is exactly what is happening right now, could produce the kind of physical shortages that are already hitting Europe and Asia. Fortune reported that fuel shortages of refined products typically hit jet fuel first, then diesel, then gasoline. Jet fuel and diesel are already tight on the West Coast. Gasoline is the last domino, and California is not the only exposed state. Washington, Oregon, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, and Alaska all stand to be among the most impacted because they share similar pipeline constraints and refinery limitations. The California Energy Commission told Fortune that jet fuel stocks remain adequate and supplies are within historic norms, although they are admittedly tight. Then Fortune asked the question that matters. Would that remain the case in June if the Strait of Hormuz is still blocked? And the California Energy Commission's answer was remarkable in its honesty. They said their analysis is thorough and ongoing, but that they cannot provide a definitive answer on that kind of forecasting. The state energy agency of the fourth largest economy in the world was asked whether its citizens will have enough fuel this summer, and the answer was, "We do not know." That is not a reassurance. That is a red flag painted in the color of bureaucratic caution. Summer driving season collides with a global supply crunch and refinery constraints at exactly the worst possible moment. Every year between Memorial Day and Labor Day, American gasoline consumption surges by approximately 400,000 to 500,000 barrels per day above the winter baseline. Families take road trips. Commutes lengthen as construction season extends work zones. Air conditioning demand pushes electricity consumption to its annual peak, which in turn pushes natural gas demand higher, which competes with the same energy infrastructure that produces and distributes transportation fuels. Refineries operate at their highest utilization rates of the year during summer, typically above 93% of capacity. And that 93% is not a comfortable number. It leaves almost no margin for unplanned outages, maintenance emergencies, or supply disruptions. One refinery going offline for a week in the summer can spike regional gasoline prices by 30 to 50 cents per gallon within days. In 2022, U.S. distillate inventories fell to a 70-year low during a period of elevated demand and tight supply. That was without a war closing 20% of global oil transit. In 2026, the summer demand surge is arriving into a market where inventories are plunging at 6.2 million barrels per week, where the strait has been closed for over 2 months, where 230 tankers are still trapped inside the Gulf, where JP Morgan warns that minimum operational inventory levels are being approached, where diesel has traded at $200 per barrel in physical markets in Asia, where European airlines are already canceling flights due to jet fuel shortages, on where the EIA has acknowledged that disruptions will continue through late 2026. The summer demand surge does not know about the war. Demand does not care about geopolitics. Americans will get in their cars because they have to get in their cars. They commute to work. They take their children to summer programs. They drive to medical appointments, to grocery stores, to the jobs that pay the bills that are already higher than they have ever been. And the gasoline that powers those trips is being drawn from a pool that is shrinking faster than it is being refilled. Bloomberg's investigation, which included interviews with more than 36 industry professionals, concluded that if the strait stays closed, the world will have to significantly reduce its oil and gas consumption, but not before prices spike to a level that forces consumers and businesses to cut back involuntarily. That forcing function is not a gradual increase. It is a price shock that arrives suddenly when inventories cross below the operational threshold and the market transitions from a price-setting mechanism to a rationing mechanism. Price setting means you pay more. Rationing means there is physically not enough to go around, regardless of what you are willing to pay. Panic buying is already happening around the world, and when it starts in America, it will make everything worse overnight. In India, unfounded panic about shortages led to people forming long queues for petrol despite the country having the fourth largest oil refining capacity in the world and substantial strategic reserves. India's crisis was described as almost entirely man-made, driven by panic buying rather than by actual physical shortages. In Australia, hundreds of gas stations reported fuel shortfalls driven in part by hoarding behavior. In the Philippines, the government declared a state of energy emergency. Myanmar restricted private vehicle use to alternate days. Pakistan told citizens to watch sports from home. Nepal began refilling only half of consumers' gas cylinders, and the pattern is consistent across every country where the fuel crisis has manifested. The actual physical shortage, while real, is amplified by a factor of 3 to 5 by panic buying. When consumers hear that gas might run out, they fill up their tanks immediately, whether they need fuel or not. That surge in demand creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Gas stations that typically carry 3 days of inventory are emptied in 1 day. The empty station becomes evidence that the shortage is real, which triggers more panic buying at nearby stations, which empties those stations. And within 48 to 72 hours, an entire metropolitan area can be stripped of gasoline without any actual disruption in the supply chain. The only disruption was behavioral. We saw this pattern in the United States in May 2021, when the Colonial Pipeline was shut down by a ransomware attack. The pipeline was offline for 6 days. Gas stations from Virginia to Florida ran dry within 48 hours. But the shortage was not caused by 6 days of pipeline closure. It was caused by panic buying that drained weeks of inventory in days. The Colonial Pipeline supplies 2.5 million barrels per day of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel to the East Coast. If the summer of 2026 produces even one regional disruption, one refinery outage, one pipeline incident, one headline that triggers hoarding behavior, the system that is already operating with depleted inventories and zero spare capacity will snap. And the speed with which it snaps will shock Americans who have never experienced a physical fuel shortage, because the American fuel distribution system is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Just-in-time delivery, minimal storage at the retail level, algorithmic routing that assumes steady supply. That system works perfectly in normal conditions. In abnormal conditions, it fails catastrophically. And the conditions of summer 2026 are the most abnormal in the history of the American fuel system. And the psychological trigger for American panic buying is not the war itself. Most Americans cannot point to the Strait of Hormuz on a map. The trigger will be the first viral image of a gas station, with bags over the pump handles and a handwritten sign that says no gas. That image, shared on Facebook, on X, on local news, will activate the same behavioral cascade that emptied gas stations across the Southeast in May 2021. Americans who had a quarter tank will fill up to full. Americans who had a full tank will fill their backup gas cans. Americans who do not own gas cans will buy them at Home Depot and fill them. That behavioral surge, repeated across millions of households in a single metropolitan area, can drain a city's gasoline supply in 24 hours. Not because the supply was cut, because the demand surged by 300 to 500% in a single day. And once the first city experiences it, the news coverage triggers the same behavior in adjacent cities. It is a contagion. And in 2026, with social media amplification, with TikTok and Instagram stories showing empty stations in real time, the contagion would spread faster than any pipeline can pump. The 2021 Colonial Pipeline incident affected primarily the Southeast. A 2026 panic buying event, driven by a genuine global energy crisis rather than a temporary ransomware attack, could affect every region of the country simultaneously. Because the fear is not that one pipeline is down, the fear is that the world is running out of oil. And that fear, once activated, does not deactivate when a government spokesperson says there is no need to panic. In 2021, the government said there was no need to panic, and the gas stations were empty anyway. The words do not matter when the pumps are dry. Diesel shortages will hit food supply chains before gasoline runs out, and your grocery store will show the damage first. Bloomberg's investigation documented that shortages of refined products typically hit jet fuel first, then diesel, then gasoline last. That sequence matters enormously for the American household because diesel shortages hit the economy before gasoline shortages hit the consumer. Every long-haul truck in America runs on diesel. When diesel becomes scarce or prohibitively expensive, trucking companies reduce routes, delay shipments, or add fuel surcharges that are passed directly to the customer. Grocery stores operate on approximately 72 hours of shelf inventory at any given time. If diesel delivery schedules are disrupted by even 48 hours, shelves begin to empty. Not all shelves, specific categories. Fresh produce goes first because it is perishable and the delivery frequency is highest. Dairy goes next. Then frozen goods as stores prioritize restocking shelf-stable items over frozen. The American consumer will see the diesel shortage before they experience the gasoline shortage. They will see it in the grocery store. Specific items unavailable. Specific shelves thin. Delivery dates missed. And the prices on the items that are available will reflect the diesel surcharges that trucking companies have been absorbing and are now passing through. And the agricultural sector is even more exposed. Farmers cannot pause operations during planting and harvest season. Diesel is not optional for a combine harvester. It is not optional for an irrigation pump. It is not optional for the trucks that carry grain from the farm to the elevator. And the EIA projects diesel prices peaking above $5.80 per gallon nationally, with California already at $7.49. For a farm operation that consumes 10,000 gallons of diesel during planting season, the difference between $3.66 per gallon in 2025 and $5.80 per gallon in 2026 is $21,400 in additional fuel cost. That cost is either absorbed by the farmer, which pushes marginal farms toward bankruptcy, or it is passed to the consumer, which pushes food prices higher still on top of the 36% cumulative increase that has already occurred since 2014. Economics Help noted that for farmers and food transport firms, there is no alternative to diesel, so the price has to rise very high to reduce demand. Diesel demand is inelastic. The price doubles and the farmer still has to plant, the trucker still has to deliver, and the consumer still has to eat. The entire burden falls on the household budget. And there is one more dimension of the diesel crisis that gets almost no coverage. Diesel is not just transportation fuel. Diesel generators are the primary backup power source for hospitals, water treatment plants, telecommunications towers, data centers, and emergency services. When a hurricane hits, when the grid fails, when the power goes out for any reason, the emergency infrastructure of the United States runs on diesel. If diesel inventories are at 70-year lows when hurricane season begins in June and a Category 3 or 4 hurricane makes landfall on the Gulf Coast, the emergency diesel supply that hospitals and water treatment facilities depend on may not be available in sufficient quantity to sustain operations. The 2022 distillate inventory low occurred outside of a major hurricane. If the 2026 inventory low coincides with a significant hurricane, the cascading failure scenario is not theoretical. It is the intersection of two independently documented vulnerabilities in the same infrastructure at the same time. and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration typically releases its hurricane season forecast in late May. If that forecast projects an above-average season, which many climate models are currently suggesting, the intersection of depleted diesel inventories and elevated hurricane probability will become the most dangerous energy security configuration the United States has faced since the strategic reserves were first established in 1975. And nobody at the federal level has publicly acknowledged this intersection. Nobody has announced contingency plans. Nobody has directed refineries to prioritize diesel production over gasoline. Nobody has pre-positioned emergency fuel supplies at coastal hospitals and water treatment facilities. The planning that should have begun in March has not begun in May. And the summer starts in 6 weeks. And every week that passes without a resolution to the Strait crisis, without a replenishment of U.S. inventories, without new refinery capacity coming online, without a diplomatic breakthrough that actually holds, the probability of a physical gasoline shortage reaching American consumers increases. Not linearly, exponentially, because the system has no slack. The buffers have been consumed, the shock absorbers are gone, and the summer driving season does not wait for geopolitics to resolve itself. 150 million Americans will get in their cars on Memorial Day weekend, whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or not. And the gasoline inventory that is supposed to power that weekend is smaller today than it was yesterday, and it will be smaller tomorrow than it is today. Nobody in Washington has a plan because every tool they have makes something else worse. Economics Help documented the policy trap that the American government faces perfectly. They noted that the default response of Western governments in 2022 to high energy prices was to subsidize prices, which kept consumer costs down but increased fiscal deficits and delayed the demand adjustment that the market needed to rebalance. In 2026, that option is more constrained because the federal deficit is already at historic peacetime levels. The national debt has crossed 100% of GDP. All 3 credit rating agencies have downgraded the United States, and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act just added $4.7 trillion to the debt through 2035. Subsidizing gasoline prices in a fiscal environment this constrained would require either additional borrowing that would further deteriorate the credit rating or spending cuts elsewhere that would deepen the pain for the same households the subsidy is supposed to protect. The second policy option is releasing more oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The IEA already coordinated a 400 million barrel release, the largest in history. The U.S. SPR is at approximately 403 million barrels, its lowest since 1984. Further releases deplete the emergency buffer without addressing the underlying supply disruption. Every barrel released from the SPR is a barrel that is not available if the crisis escalates further, if a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast during hurricane season, or if a second geopolitical disruption occurs anywhere in the global energy network. The third option is restricting U.S. oil exports to keep more crude domestic. Economics Help noted that the U.S. could respond to the crisis by restricting exports, so the crisis is felt more acutely outside the U.S., but the U.S. still needs to import heavier crude oil for producing diesel and gasoline because American refineries are configured for a crude mix that domestic light sweet shale oil alone cannot provide. Restricting exports would antagonize trading partners, potentially invite retaliatory trade measures, and would not solve the diesel problem because the diesel shortage is a global refined product shortage, not a crude supply shortage. The crude oil exists. It is trapped behind a closed strait. The refineries exist. They are running at maximum capacity. The demand exists. It is 100 million barrels per day globally. And the missing piece is the 10 to 14 million barrels per day that normally transits the Strait of Hormuz and is not transiting right now. No American policy can fix the Strait of Hormuz. That is a geopolitical problem. And the geopolitical solution, the ceasefire, has already failed. The Islamabad talks have already collapsed. The naval blockade has already been declared. And the IRGC has already threatened a severe response to any military vessel approaching the strait. The policy options are exhausted. The diplomatic options have failed. And the summer driving season starts in 6 weeks. Share this video with every American you know who drives a car, who depends on food deliveries, who has a job that requires a commute, or who heats, cools, or powers their home with anything connected to the global energy system. Because the months ahead will test every assumption Americans have ever held about the reliability of the fuel that powers their daily life. And the test has already begun. And the household-level math of what $5, $6, or $7 gasoline does to the American family that is already spending 100% of its income on essentials is brutal. The average American drives approximately 13,500 miles per year. At 25 miles per gallon, that is 540 gallons per year. At $3 per gallon, the annual fuel cost is $1,620. At $5 per gallon, it is $2,700. At $7 per gallon, it is $3,780. The difference between $3 gas and $7 gas is $2,160 per year per vehicle. For a two-car household, that is $4,320. That is a month's rent in most American cities. That is a semester of community college tuition. That is 6 months of groceries for a single person. And that $4,320 has to come from somewhere. It comes from the grocery budget, from the medical budget, from the savings that were supposed to fund retirement, from the credit card that is already at 22.76% APR and approaching its limit, and the households that have no budget to cut, no savings to draw, no credit to use, will simply stop driving. They will lose the job that requires the commute. They will miss the medical appointment that requires the drive. They will skip the grocery trip that requires the fuel. And the economy that depends on 150 million American commuters showing up to work every day will discover what happens when a meaningful percentage of them cannot afford to get there.